Welcome to the X Global News Channel. November, December, and January were the bloodiest months since the war began. The Russian armed forces brought into service the units they had assembled from mobilized men in the fall and began to actively fight the Ukrainian defense on several fronts at once. And to fight in large numbers at once, often using infantry units without the support of armored vehicles. They are being saved for major operations and, given the weather, it is almost impossible to use them in Ukraine because tanks, BMPs and other vehicles simply get stuck in the mud. Frost has not yet arrived, and the ground is muddy. Not only Russian army losses have increased, but also losses of the Ukrainian armed forces. The Ukrainian army has learned its lessons from the defeats at Severodonetsk, where units suffered heavy losses from artillery fire and even heavier losses due to the fact that unfired units were sent to the front lines, which retreated, unable to withstand the shelling, exposing their neighbors. Unfired AFU infantry are now trying not to be used in combat operations, so the defense nodes in eastern Ukraine are still holding on, but are gradually being suppressed by Russian assaults. We can say that the Russians have changed tactics, they are using less artillery ammunition, either they have another crisis there or they are saving for the future. But they use masses of infantry in several directions at once. It wears people out and requires constant concentration from officers and NCOs. You don't just sit at your positions, you have to keep an eye on everything around you. Only those with experience or flair are able to cope. If you lose focus, they will come around you, break through the defenses where they could not reinforce them in time. Casualties from small arms and grenades are increasing. Hand-to-hand skirmishes also happen, they were almost non-existent before. They have not become the norm, but in Bakhmut Soldier they happen 2 or 3 times a week, says a Ukrainian officer in the combat zone. Russian officers say the same thing. There are more casualties from small arms fire, more casualties from sabotage groups that infiltrate positions and destroy small units. While for the Ukrainian military controlling positions proved difficult but solvable, for the Russian military the most difficult task was planning offensive operations at the tactical level. We can achieve some success in 2 cases, if we have a group of downed units in the area, those that have been fighting together for a long time, those where officers and junior personnel know each other. It's easy to organize joint work and support when you need it. If this is combined with an element of luck, then you can count on success, on occupying some block, some building, some shop. The second case is when there is a multiple numerical advantage. It happens less often, but it happens. Then there is a chance to force the Ukrainian army to retreat when they realize they are being breached and bypassed. Both the former and the latter don't happen very often. Units are constantly shuffled, thrown from one place to another, experienced, real combat officers and junior officers are scarce. Very big losses among them, and basically in armies such people were minority. Therefore operative actions are often planned by those who do not know anything about it. And the misfortune starts when our units are approaching the front line by day and in columns and they are attacked straight away, when lieutenants and captains lead their people to all the wrong places, when they forget about their advancement or cannot inform about it and artillery attacks their own people. Planning and preparation is something the army doesn't know how to do yet. We are learning, but slowly and by drinking our own blood, says a commander of one of the Russian army units. High losses of the Russian armed forces are due not only to fierce battles but also to a deplorable state of organization of military medicine in the army units and the group in general. According to Russian officers, there is a shortage of medical personnel, few qualified doctors and medics, and poor arrangements for evacuation of the wounded to primary care and triage points and further to the rear. All this has already led to the situation where half of the seriously wounded do not make it to evacuation and medical care, and the slightly wounded turn into seriously wounded because their wounds were not cleaned in time or because they were not properly treated or given first aid. In many units there is one corpsman for 25 to 30 men. And he's just a regular infantryman assigned to that position. What will he do? Not everyone can react calmly to the cries of the wounded. The corpsman gets lost, goes into a stupor. Soldiers hang around a lot, too. Have you ever wondered what the main problem with the wounded in modern warfare is? To get the clods of dirt out of their mouths, which clog up everything when a man is wounded by artillery or mortar fire. You think the main thing is to apply a bandage or a tourniquet, but more often the main thing is to quickly clear a person's nose and throat so they can just breathe. And who of yesterday's civilians has the experience to go into the mouth and nose of a stranger screaming, and even so as not to injure him and not to lose a finger? Almost no one, explains the commander of one of the Russian army units. There are also problems with evacuation, but because of the hypersensitivity of the officers. The Russians say that when an injured person is brought to their unit, more than one officer is ready to take him to medical immediately. They are not eager to go back quickly. Therefore, officers often simply forbid the evacuation in order not to be left without personnel. I saw myself carrying a frail lad in 8. Naturally, you turn those slobs around with foul language and kicks. The wounded man wasn't alone. Most often, when a unit comes into position to attack, it's covered with artillery and mines. 3 to 5 to 12 wounded at once, and there's 40 men in the whole unit. You do the math, 3 wounded have 6 slashers, 12 wounded have 24. 1 shelling and you just don't have the men for the combat mission. That's why they leave and move on. If the unit is broken up, these wounded men can lie down for several hours, all the heavy ones are dead in that time, explains the Russian officer. In the war zone and on the home front too, according to the military and military doctors, there are not enough surgeons experienced in treating head and spine wounds. Because of this, a serious head wound almost always becomes fatal and they just don't know how to treat it. Shortage of medics and drugs leads to the fact that diseases, typical for the winter period, turn into severe forms. We are talking about pneumonia, flu, otitis media, and other seasonal illnesses. The same problems with fungal diseases, dysentery, pyelonephritis, urolithiasis, prostatitis, hemorrhoids. All of these diseases appear in soldiers and officers, but there are no drugs or specialists to diagnose and treat them in time. My great-grandfather told me that in 3 years of the Great Patriotic War he never once got sick. The body mobilized and survived. It's either people here have become weaker or something, but it doesn't work anymore. Every other man has snot up to his knees. One guy's panting, the other one's whistling. The soldiers with fever have boils, pus ulcers, blisters, thank God there's no plague. I have about 40 healthy men for 260, so there is nothing to be afraid of and nothing to worry about, says the commander of a Russian motorized rifle unit. The situation is better in the armed forces of Ukraine. The problem of timely evacuation of the wounded has been solved by auxiliary units, which carry the wounded from the battlefield and help doctors, who are also in short supply, but Ukrainian units have 4 times as many of them as Russian units. Because of the peculiarities of fighting at Bakhmut Soldier, it was not always possible to evacuate the wounded from the battlefield, so losses of the AFU through the wounded also increased, but the survival rate of wounded Ukrainian soldiers remains at 92%, if we talk about those who managed to get help. Of the total number of wounded, the survival rate, according to medics, is 75 to 80%, but it depends greatly on the specific situation. Since the AFU has more doctors and nurses and more medicines, the troops are working to diagnose diseases and treat them in a timely manner. A soldier who falls ill may be sent to the rear for a few days, depending on the situation and location, but in general this is true, so that he can get well and quickly return to active duty. That's about it. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications to keep up to date with new developments. Also like it and write your opinion in the comments. Thanks for watching us. See you again soon.